So something came up in my teaching studio today that I thought was too much fun to just keep to myself. This is a little blast from the past that I didn't think I'd be teaching in 2017 that is just freaking awesome. So this is how to play the introduction to Youth Gone Wild by Skid Row. And I don't know why this hasn't come up for me in a long time, but we dug into it and we got a lot out of it, so I wanted to just sort of share that with the rest of my students. This is a good example of writing from this era, like late 70s into the mid to late 80s, that uses thematic consistency and then also sort of a harmonic progression to build a riff. And what I mean is, this is similar to maybe The Trooper by Iron Maiden or Tornado of Souls by Megadeth, in which there's an iconic and very accessible piece of music, and then there's a harmonic progression that sort of dovetails with that to build the song. And the thing that I think is so amazing about working with this kind of composition structure is that it makes what you're listening to really accessible because there's a primary riff, but there's a lot of depth and detail as a player that goes into pulling this off in a way that makes sense. So I sat down with this with a student today at request, and at his request, I sat down with a student today and dug into this at his request, and we were both really pleasantly surprised by how difficult it is to play this song. So the song's in G minor, but it's built around a chord progression that goes from G minor to E flat to sort of an E flat major sound, and back to G. So these things in and of themselves are not so difficult to do. And then there's a primary riff that goes along with that, which is basically the thing that Sebastian Bach also sings, which is this guy. So neither of those things are too difficult on their own, but when you put them together, it turns into something kind of magical and a lot of fun to play. And it goes like this. So one thing I want to point out, I'm doing this with clean tone through a not that loud amp on a Strat. So obviously this isn't going to sound exactly like the song because I'm not using the same rig in terms of producing the right tone. But those of you who study with me know that I'm a big advocate of clean, quiet practice. And the reason is that as cool as all those effects are and as appropriate as they are to the style, they cover up a lot of our mistakes or inefficiencies as musicians. So I'm of the belief that using effects, using distortion and all these are things that you earn once your playing gets cleaned up. So when I learn something, when I teach something, nobody's allowed to walk into my lessons with pedals or their amp turned up. That's something that you can figure out on your own after you get the parts right, and the best way to get the parts right is to be able to listen to them clearly. So we're going to do this lesson with clean tone. It's going to sound a little unorthodox, but I think you'll be happy with the results. So, like I said, 3 chords, which we'll get to, but the primary part of the riff is done with what's called double stops, which is when you play 2 strings at the same time, but you play a melody that's consistent through both strings. So you're going to take your first finger, and you're going to be best off, instead of mashing the whole thing down like you would for a bar chord, you're going to be best off collapsing the first joint like this. And if this is something you don't have happening in your playing yet, it's a great idea to work on keeping your finger on its tip and then allowing it to collapse like that without losing the shape of the rest of your hand. And we'll get to that in a second. So once you have that happening, you can let that sit down on the 3rd fret of the D and the G strings. Once you're there, you want to tighten up your right hand, so you're picking just those strings, which means maybe anchoring your right hand if you have that happening. That's something that I do because I have small hands, and it's just how I've worked my technique out, that I tend to anchor my hand on the bridge and sometimes around the high E string so that I know exactly where I am in space. But then all my motion still comes from the wrist. So I see a lot of people do this and they move from the forearm like this, and then their playing gets really jerky and their alternating doesn't happen. If you stay anchored but you stay really loose like that, you can get some accuracy and you can still play inside this genre with a clean sound. And it translates to a lot of things. It can translate into your palm muting playing as a metal player. It can translate into your hybrid picking as a country player. So I tend to set my technique up in such a way that it fits in a variety of different genres, and this is the thing that works for me. So with that, you're going to take your first finger to the 3rd fret of the D and the G strings, and you're just going to hover over there for a second. You're going to take your first finger to the 1st fret. With that, you're going to take your 3rd finger So with that, you're going to take your first finger. So with that in mind, you're going to take your first finger to the 3rd fret of the D and G strings in that little sort of mini bar that I showed you. And you're going to play that note, slide into the 5th fret. So I'm going to slide from here to here with a lot of firmness, and I'm not really going to hear the first note of the slide so much, just the second. And then right away I'm going to go back to the 3rd fret, and then to the open string. So that gives me the basis of the primary part of the riff. So this is where it gets a little unorthodox. The next part is like the bottom of an F chord, but he doesn't finger the whole thing. He just fingers the bottom 2 notes of the major triad. So to get that sound, you're going to take your middle finger to the 3rd fret of the D string, your first finger to the 1st fret of the G string, and this will give you, if you're familiar with intervals-based theory on the guitar, this will give you the shape of a major 3rd. So you're going to play those 2 notes, and then right away with your 3rd finger, you're going to hammer on to the 3rd fret of the G string. So that gives us slide, rebound, open string, hammer. Now, to the layman, if your ears aren't totally educated, it's going to sound like the riff just goes like this. If you're a beginning guitarist, you're going to get a lot of joy out of just playing that along with the song, but that's not entirely what's happening. So what happens is he kind of dips through that open string, and then he acknowledges the chord that's going by in the harmony, and the first chord is a G minor chord, but it's hard to finger the way he's playing it, so he leaves the 3rd out. So the best way to conceive of this as a guitarist is to think about a G major chord, right? Like that. But you don't want this 3rd to be natural because it's in conflict with the chord scale relationship of the key that we're in. And if that term is new to you, we can talk about that more later too. So he omits this note by lifting his finger, and instead of reaching back here to the flat 3, which would fit inside the key, and grabbing that, he just rolls his middle finger over a little bit to mute the string. So that means when you strum, you get the root and the open strings, but not the 3rd, which is actually a really cool way of keeping that G in your vocabulary for things that aren't in major keys. So that's something you might put in your toolbox to bring out later as a writer or as a player. There's also no need for this upper note, so I'm going to leave that out, and that means I have to control my strumming with my right hand, but that gives me this shape here. So that's the first chord and also sort of home base for the song. So believe it or not, that happens before the riff. And then again afterwards. So I'm going to play this shape, and if you want to get better at this, because it's a little unorthodox, especially for people who are used to playing metal or things that are really power chord driven, you can actually train going back and forth between these 2 things. And what you'll see when you do that, and what you'll see when I do that, is that that is actually initiated from my thumb. So I'm here, and then when I'm turning to the G shape, my thumb moves a little bit. If I do that, then I keep a lot of lightness in my hand, and that lightness is necessary for playing these things that require a lot of movement. If I let my thumb come up here, then my slide up here is going to be really difficult. By the time I get down here, I'm going to be all crunched up and not able to move. So my recommendation with all these things that require dexterity, to think about moving your thumb and think about the angle of your hand a little bit. So we've got this chord here, and then we've got our slide, the release, the major 3rd shape, and a hammer to the 3rd fret, quickly through those open strings, and then back to the chord. So this is what's going to happen for the first 3 times through this riff, but with different chords. second one is going to take the same idea, but we're going to land, instead of on this G sort of open G shape, we're going to land on an E flat power chord. And the best way to play this chord for our purposes here, even though you can find it on the neck here, and you can find it on the neck here, is to root it off of the D string. And the reason that that works is because E flat is a half step above D. So that means that instead of having to jump up here for that chord, which makes grabbing the riff pretty tricky, you can just let it sit on the first fret of the D string, which means your third finger will come to the third fret of the G string. So for the second time through this riff, I'm going to go and catch the E flat power chord instead of the G. So here's what we have so far. The second half, there's a little bit of a modification. Instead of going to the open string, he actually slides up to the 5th fret, and I'll show you how this plays out. So the first part stays the same. But instead of going to the open string, he's going to take these 2 fingers up to the 5th fret. And then you'll see my first finger is kind of hanging out back here. That's because as soon as I get there, I'm going to jump back with my first finger to the 1st fret of the D string. When I do that, I'm going to grab the D string and the open G string at the same time, and that's going to give me an E major triad, or the basis of an E major triad, which again is a little unorthodox for this kind of rock and roll if you're used to playing like power chord based riffs, which is one of the reasons I think there are actually like a lot of little Easter eggs inside this song that is really easy to just sort of like put on the rate here. So the third time through, I have my slide, I have my rebound, my release, my hammer-on, but instead of going to the open string here, I'm going to take this same shape, move it up to the 5th fret, and then right back to the 1st fret with my first finger. So that gives me, right? So that's the first 3 shapes of the riff we've got. So if you think of those 3 as a set, and then the 4th as sort of a turnaround which gets you back to the top, that kind of roots us in the idea that this is in some ways connected to the roots of the electric guitar or the blues, with the idea that we have something that kind of develops thematically, and then we have something that changes that brings us around to the top again. And you'll see this happens with a lot of riffs. So the 4th time, this is something that you're probably going to have to shed on your own and then fit into the riff. This thing is still the same. So by now you should be pretty familiar with how that riff works, and it's sort of what we want to call thematic consistency between all of the other things that are happening around it. So once we get here, we're going to come back to that E flat power chord shape, but we're going to complete the chord. And this is something you're probably used to doing in other parts of the guitar, where you drop your pinky down on the string over from your ring finger and it gives you a fatter sound. Well, here I can do that on the D string, but to account for the tuning of the instrument, if I just drop that shape down, I get something that sounds cool but not so rock and roll, and it's definitely not a power chord. So if I make an adjustment for the tuning of the instrument, I can get that same chord by moving my pinky up. And this is a shape that, to my knowledge, was favored by Izzy Stradlin in Guns N' Roses, and it's something that you'll see with a lot of guys that like to play in one position instead of moving up and down the neck. So again, that's a thing you might want to just put in your toolbox because you're going to see it again. So here, I've got my slide, my open string, but instead I'm going to put this chord down, but instead of just playing the chord, I'm going to divide it up. The way I'm going to divide it up is the D string 2 times, the G and the B strings 2 times, the D string 2 times, and then I'm going to let go of that chord. I'm going to reach my first finger over to the 1st fret of the A string. I'm going to play that 1 time with a downstroke. Then I'm going to let go and play the open A string 1 time with an upstroke, and that gives me a minute to get back into position for the repeat. So that again is going to be D string, rest of the chord, D string, first finger on the A string, open A string, repeat. So that takes me to the top of the riff. So when you speed that up, that's that little detail that you might not even know is there in the song until you sort of work at it, and then suddenly it'll be clear as day that it's in there, and how did you ever miss it? And like I said, if you're a beginning player, you can get a lot of reward out of working on this song without working this in. But for those of us that have a little more dexterity and want to play with a little more accuracy, this is a great thing to work on. So that's at a moderate tempo. And then if you want to get it up to speed, I find that a little bit of palm muting helps, a little bit of anchoring helps. That's what you're looking at. So the whole thing is... So the whole thing, really slowly, is... At a slow tempo is like this. Yeah? So if you get it up to speed, it's going to, and then you put a little distortion on it, it's going to sound like the song. The thing is, if you skip this clean practice part and you go straight to the distortion, you might not be able to hear those details. And I guarantee you they're in there in the recording. So you'll be playing and wondering, like, why am I not really, it sounds like the riff, but it doesn't quite sound like it. What is it? These details are the thing that make the song, even though they might be the most subtle part.